Have you ever felt completely powerless, knowing the truth but realizing that nobody, absolutely nobody, believes you? There are two ways to completely destroy someone. You can kill them physically, leaving a body and tangible evidence of violence, or you can destroy their reputation so meticulously and absolutely that their truth ceases to matter. That every protest of innocence sounds like a desperate lie. That the entire system, law, justice, society decides guilt before even hearing a full defense. The first way is brutal, but quick. The second is prolonged torture, where you watch an entire identity being dismantled while remaining conscious of each piece that is torn away. For her, the second form of destruction began on an ordinary Monday morning at 7:15, when she was in her pajamas making coffee, and an authoritarian knock on the door changed her life irreversibly. 3 detectives, a search warrant, a formal accusation of financial fraud and money laundering that she swore with every fiber of her being she had never committed. But oaths don't matter when evidence tells a different story. And the evidence against her was devastatingly complete. Bank transfers from the firm where she worked to an account in her name that she insisted she had never opened. Emails from her computer authorizing fraudulent transactions that she swore she had never written. Documents with her signature approving the embezzlement of nearly $250,000, a signature that looked authentic, but that she knew on a cellular level, wasn't hers. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will show you something fundamental about the difference between a system that works and a system that fails spectacularly. Because the evidence incriminating her had been meticulously planted by a boss she trusted, Marcus Vance, a man who seemed like a mentor, who occasionally praised her work, who had specifically chosen her as the perfect scapegoat, an orphan with no strong family to defend her, without the financial resources for a top-tier lawyer, a quiet personality whom no one knew well enough to question the narrative being constructed. He had spent 18 months creating a false digital trail, forging signatures with sophistication that would deceive superficial analysis, opening accounts in her name, planting evidence that seemed irrefutable to any investigator who didn't dig too deep. And when a federal audit began investigating his firm, when walls started closing in, Marcus activated his contingency plan. He blamed her, presented a mountain of evidence, and prepared to disappear with real money while the legal system devoured the perfect substitute he had so carefully prepared. It was a perfect crime in conception, using the system against the person who trusted him most, turning her integrity into weakness, ensuring that protests of innocence sounded exactly like the denials every guilty person offers. The interrogation room was a nightmare she never imagined experiencing. 6 hours of repeated questions from Detective Marcus Reed, a man with a reputation for closing cases quickly through shortcuts that avoided a full investigation, pushing the same narrative: you're guilty. The evidence proves it. Stop lying and confess. And the more she denied it, the more she insisted that someone had framed her, the more desperate she sounded. Because she had no proof of innocence, only insistence that truth was different from evidence, and the legal system doesn't work on insistence. It works on evidence, and all the evidence pointed to her. But it was precisely in that moment of utter despair, when she was beginning to understand that truth wouldn't matter, that she was going to be condemned for a crime she didn't commit, simply because someone more powerful decided to sacrifice her, that he appeared. Sheriff Jake Dawson, a man she didn't even know, who had no reason to doubt such seemingly solid evidence, who, technically, wasn't even in charge of the case. He was merely a local liaison in a federal investigation. But Jake had something Detective Reed didn't: painful experience with a previous case where he had believed circumstantial evidence, where he had ignored instinct, where an innocent person spent years in prison before the truth emerged. That scar, both professional and moral, had taught Jake that sometimes the system fails spectacularly, that evidence can be manipulated, that the most convenient person isn't always the right person. So, when Jake entered that interrogation room, when he looked into her eyes for the first time, exhausted from hours of relentless questioning, clearly terrified, but not in the way guilty people are terrified. Maintaining a consistent story, even under pressure that would eventually make a liar contradict themselves. He recognized something that years of experience had taught him to identify. Not guilt, trying to hide, but the absolute terror of an innocent person realizing that truth doesn't matter when evidence tells a different story. When the system has already decided you're guilty and is just looking for confirmation, not the truth. And at that moment, Jake Dawson made a decision that would cost him his career, reputation, and professional relationships built over 20 years. He decided to believe her when literally everyone else, colleagues, superiors, the prosecution, even overworked public defenders, had already decided she was guilty, not because he had proof of her innocence, but because he had enough doubt that the evidence told the whole story. And in a system that should operate on the principle of innocent until proven guilty, doubt should be enough for a proper investigation. But a proper investigation would require challenging colleagues, questioning the work of a federal detective, risking his own position to defend a woman he barely knew. And while Jake processed the magnitude of what he was about to do, while she looked at this stranger who was offering the first indication that anyone might believe her, both were on the precipice of a journey that would test not only her innocence, but the integrity of the entire system. And to fully understand how they got there, to understand why Jake's gamble on her was so risky, you need to know who she was before her life imploded. Before everything fell apart, she was exactly the kind of person who goes through life doing everything right, not out of a neurotic need for perfection, but simply because she genuinely, and perhaps naively, believed that honesty and hard work would eventually pay off. At 28, she had built a modest but stable life, working as an administrative assistant at a financial consulting firm for 3 years. It wasn't a glamorous or particularly well-paid position, but it paid the bills, offered security, allowed her a small but private apartment, an old but functional car, and an existence that was predictable in a way she found comforting. She wasn't the type of person to take unnecessary risks or get involved in dramas. She maintained a small social circle, a few colleagues with whom she had cordial but not intimate relationships, acquaintances she saw occasionally for dinner or a movie, but no one truly close. This solitude wasn't accidental. It was a legacy of loss that defined her. Her parents died in a car accident 5 years ago, a sudden tragedy that left her essentially alone in the world. Besides a distant aunt in another state whom she saw perhaps once a year. She grew up in a middle-class family that emphasized values like integrity and responsibility. Her father was a meticulous accountant who preached absolute honesty, and her mother was an elementary school teacher who believed in doing the right thing even when it was difficult. She had internalized these lessons completely, building her identity around being a trustworthy, honest person who followed rules because believing in structure and order seemed safer than any alternative. If you've ever been the person who always did everything right but was still unfairly punished, if you've ever felt that the universe doesn't reward kindness the way it should, share in the comments, because recognizing that we're not alone in this frustration is sometimes the first step in processing injustice, because the brutal irony of her situation was that precisely those qualities, being reliable, quiet, without a strong support network, made her the perfect target for Marcus Vance. He didn't choose her by accident. He chose her because he had studied employees, identified who would have the fewest resources to defend themselves, who would be the least likely to be believed if they protested their innocence. Marcus Vance was everything she aspired to be, professionally at least on the surface. Charismatic without being intrusive, competent without being arrogant, a mentor who occasionally noticed her work, praised her attention to detail, and suggested there was a path to promotion if she continued to demonstrate dedication. She had trusted him, not romantically, but professionally, the way a junior employee trusts a superior who seems invested in her success. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that for 18 months, while she diligently did her job, Marcus was setting a trap. Using access credentials she never knew she'd provided, forging her signatures with software that analyzed hundreds of documents she legitimately signed, creating a bank account in her name, using documents she'd given for standard payroll processing, building a digital trail that would perfectly incriminate her when he needed a scapegoat. And when the federal audit began, when outside investigators started asking questions about discrepancies, Marcus could no longer hide. He activated his plan. He presented evidence pointing to her. He expressed shock and disappointment that a trusted employee had betrayed him. He cooperated fully with investigators, providing access to everything they needed, playing the role of the virtuous victim while systematically destroying her life. The morning the police knocked on her door was an instant transformation from normal life to a Kafkaesque nightmare. She was taken to the police station, still processing that this was really happening, that it wasn't a mistake that could be quickly corrected. In the interrogation room, reality crystallized when Detective Marcus Reed began presenting evidence. Each item seemed irrefutable. Each of her explanations sounded desperate, even to her own ears. If this part resonated with you in any way, if you recognized the terror of being accused of something you didn't do and realizing that truth isn't a sufficient defense, leave a like so I know you're connected to this story. Because what she experienced in those first few hours was a complete collapse of everything she believed about how the world worked. She had always believed that truth mattered, that the system existed to protect the innocent, that if you simply calmly explained what really happened, the authorities would listen and investigate. But the system doesn't work that way when the evidence is strong and you lack resources. The public defender assigned to her, a young man overwhelmed with 60 simultaneous cases, looked at the evidence and immediately began talking about a plea deal. Look, if you confess, the prosecution can offer a reduced sentence, 5 years instead of 15. With good behavior, you get out in 3. It's a better option. He was being pragmatic, not cruel. But his pragmatism was based on accepting that the system had already decided that fighting would be a more devastating loss. But I didn't, she insisted. I can't confess to something I didn't do. The evidence says he did it. The jury will believe the evidence. At least he was honest. Your testimony against documents, bank records, forensic analysis. You lose. Sorry to be blunt, but it's reality. And she understood, with a clarity that was physically nauseating, that she was going to be condemned. That she was going to lose her freedom, reputation, and future for a crime she didn't commit. That her protest of innocence would be recorded as a typical denial by a criminal unwilling to accept responsibility. That nobody, literally nobody, believed her. Until Jake Dawson entered that interrogation room. Until he started asking different questions, looking for inconsistencies in evidence that everyone else had accepted without question, giving the first indication that maybe, just maybe, someone was willing to consider that she was telling the truth. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories about people who refuse to accept injustice, even when literally everyone around them accepts it, about connections that are born when someone finally believes in you when no one else does, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because what Jake was about to do challenged colleagues, question seemingly solid evidence, risk his reputation for a woman he barely knew, wasn't cinematic heroism. It was a brutal moral choice by a man who had learned a painful lesson about the cost of not questioning convenient narratives. And that choice was going to cost him more than he anticipated. It was going to test the limits of how many bridges you can burn before becoming completely isolated. But first, to understand why Jake took that risk, you need to know the scar he carried. The experience that had taught him that the system he had dedicated his entire life to serving could fail spectacularly. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to fully understand the magnitude of the betrayal she suffered, to understand why her choice to trust Marcus Vance was not naivete, but a completely reasonable response to a carefully constructed situation, you need to know not only who she was, But how she got there? The life journey that shaped her into a person who valued stability above all else, who saw professional hierarchy as a protective structure rather than a potential trap, who believed that doing a job correctly was enough for security. Her life had been marked by loss in a way that completely defined how she navigated the world. Growing up with parents who emphasized values like integrity and responsibility wasn't oppressive, it was comforting. Her father worked as an accountant at a mid-sized firm, frequently bringing work home, explaining to her from a young age how numbers told stories, how meticulous attention to detail was the difference between order and chaos. Her mother taught third grade, returning home with stories about the children she taught, about the importance of doing the right thing even when no one was watching. They weren't rich, but they were stable, and stability was a luxury she only fully recognized when it was ripped away. The accident happened when she was 23, her parents returning from a weekend getaway for their wedding anniversary. Their car crossing the median line on a rural highway, a head-on collision that killed them both instantly. She received a call from the hospital, drove for 3 hours in shock, arrived to identify the bodies, and discovered that her entire life had ended in a fraction of a second. There were no siblings, grandparents already deceased. Her maternal aunt lived in another state, had her own family offered condolences but not closeness, and friends her age, still in college, dealing with their own lives, didn't know how to process a loss of that magnitude. So they gradually distanced themselves, not out of cruelty but out of discomfort. So she learned, brutally and quickly, to function on her own. She finished college even through a haze of grief. She got a job not in her field of study, literature, but in something practical that paid consistently: administration. She built a life that was deliberately small, controlled, predictable, because unpredictability had cost her everything that mattered. The job at the financial consulting firm wasn't her dream job, but it was secure. The routine was comfortingly simple: arriving at 8, processing documents, answering emails, organizing schedules for consultants, who rarely noticed her beyond the occasional thank you. Her salary paid the rent for a modest apartment, maintained a company car, and allowed for small savings that represented her only safety net. And Marcus Vance, when she started working there 3 years ago, had seemed exactly the kind of boss who valued her work. Not in a paternalistic or intrusive way, but in a professional way that she appreciated. He noticed when she stayed late to finish a project. He commented on her attention to detail. He occasionally asked about her weekends, in a way that seemed polite, not intrusive. "You're the kind of employee who makes the company run," he once said, walking past her desk. "People don't notice administrative work until it's not done properly. But I do, and I appreciate it." They were crumbs of validation. But for someone operating in relative isolation, who had no family to praise her, or close friends who understood her work context, those crumbs mattered. Not romantically. She never saw Marcus that way, and he never gave any indication that he saw her that way. But professionally, she began to trust his judgment, to value his approval. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, because predators like Marcus are masters at building trust, before exploiting it, was that every interaction had been calculated, that he had specifically identified her through a meticulous selection process. An orphan without a strong family, without a robust social network, a quiet personality that didn't make waves, a history of scrupulously following rules, a perfect scapegoat profile. Because for Marcus's scheme to work, he needed someone who would seem plausible as a criminal to casual observers, but who wouldn't have the resources to adequately defend themselves. Someone with access to systems, but no real power. Someone whose protests of innocence would be dismissed as typical denials. And she fit the bill perfectly. Over the course of 18 months, Marcus meticulously constructed a digital trail that even experienced investigators would accept without question. He used her login credentials, obtained through social engineering tactics she didn't even recognize as malicious at the time. I need you to log into the system for me quickly. My computer is having problems. A request that seemed reasonable from a superior, especially when he was standing next to her, seemingly just checking if the system was working. He forged her signatures, using software that analyzed hundreds of documents she had legitimately signed, creating synthetic versions that would pass even superficial forensic analysis. He opened a bank account in her name, using documents she provided for standard payroll processing, copies of identification, social security numbers, documents that employees routinely provide, believing they will go to secure files, but which, in the hands of someone with access and malicious intent, become tools for fraud. And he constructed a timeline of transfers that would appear to show a gradual escalations, small deviations initially, that grew as she became more confident, a pattern investigators would expect to see from an amateur criminal becoming progressively bolder. It was a crime perfectly designed from the outset, using intimate knowledge of how investigations work against the very structures that should protect the innocent. When the federal audit began, when outside investigators noticed discrepancies that Marcus could no longer hide through book manipulation, he had a contingency plan ready. He presented a discovery that a trusted employee had betrayed him. He provided full access to all incriminating documents. He expressed appropriate shock and disappointment as a mentor who felt he had failed to detect corruption. He cooperated completely, playing the role of a virtuous victim, while knowing full well that he was destroying the life of an innocent person. And she received no warning. There was no moment when Marcus revealed his true colors, no prior threat, just a knock on the door on a Monday morning, police officers with a warrant, accusations. That seemed absurd until evidence was presented and the absurdity became apparent reality. The transformation from normal life to nightmare happened at a speed that left no time to process, only to react. In the interrogation room, after hours of relentless questioning, after seeing seemingly irrefutable evidence, after Detective Reed repeated variations of just confess and make it easier for everyone, she understood with devastating clarity it didn't matter that she was innocent. It didn't matter that the truth was on her side. Because truth without proof is just an allegation, and she had no proof of her innocence. How do you prove you didn't open an account when documents show you did? How do you prove you didn't write emails when they come from your computer with your credentials? How do you prove the signature isn't yours when analysis says it matches? You don't prove it. You just insist. And insistence sounds exactly like the denial every guilty person offers. The public defender assigned to her confirmed what she had already begun to understand. The system wasn't interested in the truth. It was interested in closing the case. The evidence is too strong, he said, not without sympathy but with brutal pragmatism. The jury will look at documents, bank records, forensic analysis, and will decide you're guilty. The best option is to negotiate a plea deal. Confess for a reduced sentence. But I didn't. The protest sounded weak, even to her own ears, not because she doubted her own innocence, but because she had repeated it so many times that words had lost their weight. I believe you believe that. His response was carefully calibrated. But what I believe doesn't matter. What the jury believes matters, and a jury will believe the evidence. It was in this moment of utter despair, when the future had narrowed to a choice between confessing to a crime she didn't commit for a reduced sentence, or fighting and likely receiving the maximum sentence, that Jake Dawson entered the room. And for the first time since the nightmare began, someone looked at her and saw not a criminal but a person. Someone asked questions that sought truth instead of confirmation of pre-decided guilt. Someone recognized that seemingly solid evidence deserved scrutiny instead of automatic acceptance. She didn't know then that Jake had his own reasons for questioning convenient narratives, that he carried the scars of a case where he had failed an innocent person by following protocol instead of instinct. She didn't know that his decision to believe her would cost him professional relationships, reputation, possibly his career. She only knew that for the first time in days that seemed like an eternity. Someone was treating her like a human being instead of a convicted criminal. And that basic recognition of humanity, after being treated as evidence to be processed instead of a person to be heard, was transformative in ways that would take her time to fully process. Comment below. This makes sense to me because sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do is simply believe you, when literally, everyone else has already decided you're lying. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a brutal difference between intellectually understanding that you are being accused of a crime and viscerally feeling, in real time, your entire life being dismantled, while you remain conscious but completely powerless to stop it. For her, that Monday morning at 7:15 was not just a life-changing moment. It was a moment that completely obliterated the person she was and replaced her with a criminal version that existed only in documents, but that the legal system accepted as more real than herself. The sound of the knocking on the door was what snapped her out of her usual morning trance. Loud, authoritative, repeated impatiently when she didn't answer immediately. She was in her pajamas, her hair still disheveled, her coffee half finished, her mind still processing the transition from sleep to wakefulness. She looked through the peephole and saw uniforms, badges, expressions that allowed no negotiation. Immediate, primal terror flooded her system before her brain could process why. She opened the door because not opening it wasn't an option when authority knocks. 3 detectives, 2 in blue uniforms, who filled the narrow corridor with an intimidating physical presence. 1 in civilian clothes with a briefcase and the expression of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. Sarah Mitchell, using her full name instead of her first name, made it sound official, distant, threatening. Yes, her voice came out small. Search and seizure warrant. Formal accusation of financial fraud and money laundering. Words were delivered without emotion. Protocol followed. Rights read aloud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. ... She had heard those words in movies, in TV series, never imagining they would be directed at her. They sounded surreal, as if she were watching the scene unfold with someone else. But the hands that guided her firmly into her own apartment, while the team began the search, were undeniably real. Fingers in uniform opening drawers, searching closets, photographing everything. Confiscating the laptop she used for everything: personal communication, family photos, her entire digital life. I need to get dressed, she managed to say, realizing she was still in her pajamas, and that neighbors were starting to appear at doorways, peering through curtains. Quick, an officer will accompany you. No privacy, no dignity, not even to change clothes. She grabbed the first thing. She saw jeans, a t-shirt, mismatched shoes, dressing with trembling hands, while a female officer watched to ensure she didn't destroy evidence or try to escape. The drive to the police station was silent, except for crackling police radio communications. She sat in the back of the patrol car, not handcuffed, technically not under arrest yet, but separated from the officers in the front by a metal barrier that made her status perfectly clear. Neighbors definitely saw. Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door was at the window, phone in hand, probably already spreading the news. The social life she had, small but existent, was ending in real time. At the police station, she was processed with bureaucratic efficiency that made the horror all the more surreal. Photos, fingerprints, personal belongings confiscated and catalogued. Then the interrogation room, a small, claustrophobic space, with a metal table bolted to the floor, uncomfortable chairs, a mirror that she knew was one-way glass, where others could observe without being seen. Fluorescent lighting flickered minimally, a buzzing sound in her ears that made it difficult to concentrate. Detective Marcus Reed entered with a thick briefcase, the expression of someone who had already decided on guilt and was merely following interrogation protocol. He sat on the other side of the table, opened the briefcase with deliberate theatricality, and began placing documents one by one in front of it. Bank transfers. From the firm's account to an account in your name. $240,000 over 18 months. Do you want to explain that? She looked at the documents, saw her name, numbers that looked astronomical. I didn't open this account. I've never seen anything like this before. The documents say otherwise. The signature here, he pointed out, is yours. No, it's not. Someone faked it. Handwriting analysis says it's compatible. So either the expert with 20 years of experience is wrong, or you're lying. This wasn't presented as a question, but as a fact. Next document. Emails from your computer authorizing transfers. IP traced to your work terminal. Timestamps show hours during which you were working. How do you explain this? I didn't write those emails. Someone used my credentials. Was the password shared? Tom suggested that he already knew the answer. NOI. No, I never shared. But even as she said this, she remembered times Marcus had asked her to log in for him, requests that seemed reasonable from a superior with technical problems. Had she been careful? Had she always logged out afterward? Doubt began to erode certainty. So how did someone use it without you knowing? Detective Reed was cornering her, using logic. Against her, I don't know. But it wasn't me. Why would I steal money and leave it in an account with my name on it? That doesn't make sense. Criminals make mistakes. You're not the first smart person who thought you wouldn't get caught. A complete dismissal. As if her protest was exactly what she expected from a guilty party. The interrogation continued for hours. The same questions were repeated from different angles, searching for inconsistencies she might slip up on. She tried to keep her story consistent because it was true, but exhaustion and terror were eroding her ability to articulate clearly. And the more she tried to explain, the more desperate she sounded, even to her own ears. During the break, when Reed left momentarily, she was alone in the room, head in her hands, trying to process how she was there. Life had been normal 24 hours ago. Work, routine, nothing extraordinary. How had everything happened so quickly and completely? The truth she didn't yet fully understand, a truth that would only emerge through research Jake Dawson would eventually conduct, was that every piece of evidence had been meticulously planted by Marcus Vance over 18 months. He had studied how investigations work, anticipated exactly what kind of evidence would be needed to build a compelling case, and created a digital trail that would satisfy investigators looking to close the case quickly. A bank account in her name had been opened using documents she provided for standard HR processing information employees routinely provide, believing it goes into secure files. Marcus, as a senior executive with broad access, had simply copied everything he needed. Forged signatures, used software that analyzed hundreds of legitimate examples, creating synthetic versions that would pass superficial scrutiny. Emails were sent from her computer during times when she was demonstrably at her desk, but Marcus had physical access to the office, possessing system administrator credentials that allowed remote login to any terminal. Everything had been designed to appear irrefutable to an investigator who didn't dig beyond the surface. And Reed wasn't digging. He was accepting evidence as presented, building a case against convenient suspicion, following the path of least resistance, as he had done in dozens of cases before. When Reed returned, he brought a public defender, an obviously overworked young man who quickly reviewed the evidence and immediately began talking about a plea deal. Look, I'll be honest. The evidence is strong. Very strong. If this goes to trial, you'll probably lose. But if we negotiate now, I can get you a reduced sentence. Maybe 5 years, instead of 15. With good behavior, you get out in 3. But I didn't, she insisted, her voice breaking. I can't confess to something I didn't do. I understand it's difficult. His tone was sympathetic, but pragmatic. But you need to consider reality. The jury will see documents, records, expert analysis. It will seem obvious that you are guilty. And the jury won't sympathize. We're talking about financial fraud. Almost $250,000. They'll want an example. It was at that moment that she fully understood. The system wasn't interested in the truth. It was interested in solving the case. And she was the perfect solution, strong evidence. Without resources for an adequate defense, a profile that a jury wouldn't particularly sympathize with, she was being processed by the system like a cog in an assembly line, not as a person with the right to the presumption of innocence. And it was precisely in that moment of utter despair, when the public defender was literally arguing that confession was the only rational option, that the door opened and a man she had never seen before entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, sheriff's badge instead of a federal detective's. He looked at her not the way Reed looked, seeking to confirm guilt, but in a different way, assessing, processing. "I'm Sheriff Dawson," he said. "I need to ask a few questions, different from the ones Detective Reed asked." And for the first time since the nightmare began, she felt something beyond terror, a small, fragile hope that perhaps someone was willing to listen, instead of just processing it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand why Jake Dawson made a decision that technically exceeded his authority, and that would cost him professional relationships, built over 2 decades, you need to know not only the police officer he was, but the man he became through a mistake he could never fully forgive himself for. Because people don't become advocates for justice against the system itself by accident. They become so through a specific scar, through a failure that teaches such a painful lesson that it completely redefines how they operate. Jake Dawson wasn't initially involved in her case. It was a federal investigation, completely outside his jurisdiction as sheriff of a small adjacent county. He had plenty of work of his own, a rural county, with all the typical problems of an area growing too fast for infrastructure to keep up. Crime escalating from petty theft to more sophisticated drug operations, and a perpetually inadequate budget for growing needs. The last thing he needed was to be pulled into a federal case as a liaison. But Marcus Vance had structured his financial consulting firm in such a way that it operated in multiple jurisdictions, main office in one city, but satellite offices in surrounding counties, including Jake's territory. So, when the federal investigation began, they needed local cooperation for access to documents, to coordinate logistics, and to have an official presence familiar with the area. Jake was assigned, not because he was the obvious choice, but because the previous sheriff had a relationship with the federal agent in charge, and when that sheriff retired, Jake inherited that connection. Along with the badge, liaison roles generally meant rubber stamping other people's work, facilitating without question, maintaining smooth interdepartmental relationships. Jake had done this dozens of times. Federal cases need to use local facilities. Jake provides access. Feds need to serve a warrant in his jurisdiction. Jake coordinates. It was protocol. It was politics. It was a way to maintain cooperation that benefited everyone. At 40 years old, Jake had 20 years of experience in law enforcement, following a traditional career path. He started as a municipal police officer at 20, patrolling streets, learning the job through night shifts and domestic calls that never got any easier, no matter how many times he responded. He worked as a detective for 8 years, building a reputation as a meticulous investigator who followed evidence wherever it led, who didn't give up on cases just because they got difficult. He was elected sheriff 6 years ago, not through a sophisticated political campaign, but through reputation. When the previous sheriff announced his retirement, the community specifically sought out Jake, not because he was charismatic, he wasn't. Not because he played politics, he actively avoided it, but because he had a reputation for being fair, for treating everyone equally, regardless of connections or wealth, for not cutting corners even when it would be more convenient. Colleagues respected him even when they didn't like him, because Jake didn't play the games most people played. He didn't protect the children of powerful people just because their families donated to campaigns. He didn't look the other way when a friend broke the law. He didn't accept that "we've always done it this way" was a justification for questionable practices. This rigidity made him effective, but not exactly popular. Department parties. Jake would show up briefly, observe minimal social protocol, and leave early. After shift drinks. Rarely. And when he went, he stayed quiet, observing more than participating. But rigidity came at a personal cost that Jake rarely admitted, but that defined his life completely. He had few genuine friends, colleagues he respected, but wasn't close to. Acquaintances he saw occasionally, but without real intimacy. Romantic relationships were complicated by work that consumed his life. By the fact that being with Jake meant accepting that badges would always come first, that dinners would be interrupted, that plans would be canceled, that he carried a work burden that made genuine relaxation almost impossible. There was a loneliness about him that only observant people noticed, not dramatic isolation, but the quietness of someone who had built walls so effectively that he no longer even realized he was living behind them. An empty house, a refrigerator full of food that often spoiled before he could cook. A silence that should have been peace, but often seemed just ... empty. But Jake hadn't become this way, by accident or by nature. He had learned through a specific mistake, through an event that still haunted him 8 years later, which had taught him a brutal lesson about the cost of following protocol when instincts screamed to do something different. Her name was Rebecca Torres, 23 years old, a witness in a robbery case. She had clearly seen the faces of the robbers and was willing to testify. Jake was investigating, had assured her that she was safe, that protocol was being followed. But Rebecca insisted that something was wrong, that one of the robbers had connections with local police, that she didn't feel safe even with official protection. Jake had dismissed her concerns. Protocol exists for a reason. The system works if you trust it. Words that still echoed, that still made him shudder years later. Because Rebecca was right. There was a leak in the department, not his, but in an adjacent department that shared information. And muggers found out where she was, intimidated her into retracting her testimony. The prosecution, without a star witness, offered a plea deal that meant the robbers got months instead of years. And Rebecca, terrified of retaliation, accepted living in constant fear. 6 months later, an unrelated incident resulted in her being seriously injured, officially an accident. But Jake knew better. He had followed protocol perfectly. He had done everything the manual said. And she had suffered anyway because protocol didn't accommodate. The reality that the system had vulnerabilities that bad people exploited. Jake had visited her in the hospital, had seen fear in her eyes, had heard an implicit accusation. You said you would be safe if you trusted the system. From then on, Jake operated differently. He still followed evidence, still respected due process, but with a crucial addition. When instinct told him something was wrong, when the pattern didn't fit, he dug deeper instead of accepting a convenient narrative. Colleagues saw this as inconvenient stubbornness. Jake saw it as a moral obligation. So when he entered that interrogation room to observe the federal case, when he saw her, Sarah Mitchell, a name he had read on file, but which was just an abstraction until he saw the real person, something about the entire presentation bothered him. The evidence was strong, yes, but it was also too clean, too convenient, without the complications that real cases usually have. And she exhausted after 6 hours of questioning. By Reed, clearly terrified, but not in the way guilty people usually are. Guilty people have a certain defensive quality, an aggressiveness born from knowing they are lying and need to sell a lie. She had pure terror of someone who is telling the truth and realizing that nobody believes her. Jake watched through the one-way glass as Reed repeated the same questions for the 10th time. Saw how she maintained a consistent story, down to the small details. Liars usually slip up on details when pressed. Repeatedly, contradicting themselves on minor aspects. She wasn't. Her story was simple, consistent. I didn't do it. Someone framed me. Please investigate. And when the public defender began arguing for a plea deal, when Jake saw resignation begin to replace terror in her eyes, acceptance that truth didn't matter, that the system had decided something in him, recognized Rebecca Torres. He recognized an innocent person being prosecuted through a system that wasn't interested in truth, only in closing a convenient case. Jake made a decision that technically exceeded his authority. He interrupted the interrogation, pulled Reed into the hallway, and challenged the investigation. Did you verify the authenticity of the signatures? Digital forensics on the emails. Traced the money to see where it really went. The evidence speaks for itself, Reed replied, irritated by the question. Evidence needs to be verified before it can be called evidence. Jake didn't back down. That's basic. Investigation. Tensions rose, but Jake had seniority in the local area and Reed needed his cooperation. They agreed. Jake would have 48 hours to independently verify evidence. When Jake returned to the room, he looked directly at her for the first time. He saw not a criminal, but a person scared, alone, desperate to be believed. I'm Sheriff Dawson. I'm going to ask you different questions. I need you to answer with absolute truth. Do you understand? She nodded, and for the first time in hours, something other than terror appeared in her eyes, a fragile hope that perhaps someone was willing to listen. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Sometimes the only difference between justice and injustice is a person willing to question when everyone else has already accepted the easy answer. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a specific moment in any journey of injustice where everything changes, not because evidence changes, or because truth is revealed, but simply because one person decides to question a narrative that everyone else accepted without thinking. For her and Jake, that moment came when he entered that interrogation room and did something no one else had done. He treated her as a credible witness, instead of a confessed criminal. As someone deserving of proper investigation, instead of expedited prosecution. The interrogation had already lasted 6 hours, when Jake was called in to observe. 6 hours is an eternity, when you're under flashing fluorescent lights, in an uncomfortable chair, being bombarded with accusations you can't refute because you're proving the negative, a logically impossible task that the legal system theoretically recognizes but in practice ignores when circumstantial evidence is strong enough. Jake entered an adjacent observation room, separated from the interrogation room by one-way glass that allowed him to see without being seen. Federal Detective Marcus Reed was on the other side, a man Jake knew from previous cases and actively disliked. Reed had a reputation in law enforcement circles as an investigator who took shortcuts, who built cases on convenient suspects instead of the right suspects, who measured success by conviction rate rather than by truth achieved. You opened the account, Reed was saying, his voice heavy with the frustration of someone who had repeated the same words so many times they had lost their meaning. Emails came from your computer. The signature is yours. Stop lying and confess. It makes things easier for everyone. I'm not lying. Her voice was hoarse, worn down from 6 hours of repeating the same defense that no one would accept. I didn't do it. Someone framed me. Please, just investigate. We investigated. Evidence points to you. Consistently, unequivocally, Reed cut in, not interested in hearing an 11th variation of the same denial. Jake observed through the glass, studying not only words but body language. Micro-expressions, all signs that 20 years of experience had taught him to read. She maintained eye contact with Reed, even when it would have been psychologically easier to look down, to escape the intensity of constant accusation. People who lie usually avoid eye contact, or maintain it excessively in an obviously performative way. Hers was natural, desperate, a genuine plea to be believed. Her hands were trembling. Jake could see it, even from a distance. But the trembling wasn't the nervousness of a guilty woman worried her lie would be exposed. It was the physical and emotional exhaustion of 6 hours under relentless pressure. The absolute terror of someone realizing that truth isn't a sufficient defense when the system has already decided. And her story remained consistent down to the small details. Jake had paid attention to files before coming, had read transcripts from the first 4 hours of interrogation. She had said the same things not just in general terms, but in specifics that liars usually change when pressed repeatedly. When was the last day she saw Marcus Vance? Friday, around 4:30. He was leaving when I passed him in the hallway. Same answer, hour 1, hour 3, hour 6. Consistent little details that either meant she had meticulously rehearsed the story, or that she was simply reporting real memory. Is she lying? Another officer in the observation room asked Jake, assuming that sheriff, with 2 decades of experience, would have a definitive opinion. I don't know, Jake answered honestly, because honesty mattered more than feigning certainty he didn't feel. But Reed isn't asking the right questions. He's assuming guilt and seeking confirmation, not genuinely investigating alternatives. The evidence is solid. She's a good suspect. The officer shrugged, as if the case were too obvious to question. Evidence is circumstantial until we verify its authenticity, Jake corrected. And from what I've read in the file, nobody has verified it yet. Nobody has brought in an independent expert for signatures. Nobody has done in-depth digital forensic analysis of the emails. Nobody has traced money beyond the first layer of transfers. Jake had read the file completely on the spot before coming to observe not just the executive summary, but attached documents, investigators' notes, the constructed timeline. And the more he read, the more unanswered questions he identified. The evidence was strong on the surface, yes, but it was also suspiciously perfect, to clean, to convenient, to obvious. Real cases usually have complications, minor inconsistencies, aspects that don't fit perfectly because reality is messy. This seemed, constructed, and the stated motivation didn't make sense when juxtaposed with her profile. According to the file, she lived in a modest apartment that she rented for $800 a month, drove a 10-year-old Honda that had 120,000 miles on it, and didn't have extravagant spending on her credit card meals at home, most of the time, clothes from discount stores, entertainment limited to basic streaming services. This person allegedly embezzled $240,000 out of greed. For what purpose? Where was the money? According to Reed, it was in an account she opened, but the account had been emptied shortly after each transfer. Transferred to where? Investigation continues, the file vaguely stated, which meant that Reed didn't know, and hadn't prioritized finding out because she already had a convenient suspicion. That was when Jake made a decision that technically exceeded his authority as liaison. He wasn't an investigator on the case. He had no jurisdiction over federal crimes. His role was to facilitate, not to drive. But Rebecca Torres still haunted him, and Jake had sworn after that case that he would never again stand idly by when his instinct told him something was fundamentally wrong. He left the observation room and knocked on the interrogation door. Reed looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "Reed, can I have a moment? We're in the middle of," he began to protest. Now, it wasn't a request. It was a command, loaded with the authority of a sheriff in his own territory. A tone Jake rarely used, but which was unmistakable when employed. Reed excused himself from the room and joined Jake in the hallway. "What's so urgent? Did you verify the authenticity of the signatures? Did you bring in an independent expert? Did you conduct a complete digital forensic analysis of the emails, verifying not only their origin, but also the possibility of forgery? Did you trace the money beyond the first layer to see its final destination?" Jake fired off questions rapidly. "I don't need to. The evidence speaks for itself." Defensive response. Circumstantial evidence needs to be verified before it can be called conclusive evidence. That's basic investigation. Jake maintained a professional, but firm, tone. "Are you questioning my work?" Reed turned to confront him, his ego wounded. "I'm questioning whether you're doing your job or just conveniently closing cases with suspects who can't adequately defend themselves." Gloves came off. Jake wasn't interested in diplomacy when he saw a potentially innocent person being processed through the system by a lazy investigator. "I have 20 years of experience," Me too. And in 20 years, I've learned that evidence that seems too perfect is usually because someone made it seem that way. So are you going to check it, or should I? The tension in the hallway was palpable. Other officers noticed, stopping to observe the confrontation between the federal detective and the local sheriff. Reed couldn't dismiss Jake completely. He needed local cooperation for continued access to resources, witnesses, and logistics. But he also didn't want to admit that he hadn't done basic due diligence. 48 hours, Red finally conceded. You have 48 hours to independently investigate. If you find anything, the case remains open for further investigation. If not, she is formally charged and we prosecute. Deal. Agreed. Jake was already mentally prioritizing what to check first. She returned to the interrogation room. She looked up, red-eyes, defeated posture, clearly expecting another round of accusations. Jake sat on the other side of the table, a position Red had occupied for hours, but his body language was completely different, not leaning aggressively, not encroaching on space, just present, attentive. "I'm Sheriff Dawson," he said, his voice deliberately softer than the tone he used with Reed. "I'm going to ask you different questions than Detective Reed did. And I need you to answer with absolute truth, not what you think I want to hear. Not what you think will help the case. Just the truth. Do you understand?" She nodded, confused but also with something else appearing for the first time. Hope. Fragile. Cautious, but present. And it was in that exchange, Jake choosing to doubt a convenient narrative when literally everyone else accepted it. Her choosing to trust another police officer when 6 hours of interrogation had taught her that authority wasn't on her side, that the connection began. It wasn't romance. It wasn't attraction. It was something more fundamental, a mutual recognition of humanity. She saw someone willing to listen instead of just accusing. Jake saw someone who deserved to be listened to instead of just prosecuted. And this mutual recognition, born in a moment of absolute vulnerability and moral choice, would become the foundation of everything that would come after. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there comes a point in any investigation where you cross from the territory of reasonable doubt into the territory of moral certainty, not certainty based on complete evidence, because that is still being built, but certainty born from a recognizable pattern, from pieces that begin to fit together in a way that tells a completely different story from the official narrative. For Jake, that point arrived within the first 12 hours of beginning his independent investigation. When he explored every angle that Reed had conveniently ignored revealed, not only flaws in the evidence against her, but active indicators of an elaborate conspiracy. Jake began his own investigation immediately after leaving that interrogation room, working through the night because 48 hours wasn't enough time for a proper investigation. But it was all he had negotiated. The first step was a digital forensic analysis of the emails, not the superficial one the prosecution had done, but a thorough one involving a specialist Jake knew from previous cases. A man who had testified in dozens of trials about the authenticity of digital communications. "I need you to look at timestamps, metadata, any indicator of whether these emails were sent from the terminal they claim to have been sent from," Jake explained, handing over drives with copies he had obtained through an emergency warrant granted by a friendly judge. Based on Jake's argument that independent verification was necessary before formal charges, the expert worked for 6 hours, returned with a report that confirmed Jake's instinct. Timestamps don't match. Emails allegedly sent at 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was in a meeting with HR at that time. There's an entry. Log. Witnesses. An email at 2:40 p.m. on a Thursday. The security system shows she left the building at 2:20 p.m. for lunch and didn't return until 3:10 p.m., physically impossible for her to have sent it. So where were they sent from? Jake pressed. Remote access. Someone with system administrator credentials logged in remotely to her terminal, sent emails, and covered their tracks reasonably well. But not perfectly. There are digital markers that show the access was not from her physical location. It was solid evidence of forgery. But Jake needed more. He brought in a second handwriting analysis expert, not the one the prosecution had used, who had declared the signatures matching, but a specialist with a PhD in forensic document analysis who had a reputation for being meticulous to the point of being obsessive. The expert spent 8 hours with original documents, using specialized equipment that measured pen pressure, stroke angles, and micro inconsistencies invisible to the naked eye. Forgeries, he finally declared. Sophisticated ones. Whoever did this used software that analyzed real samples of it, creating synthetic versions. But there it tells the pressure is too uniform. There's no natural variation that a human hand produces. The pen was guided by a machine, not by a person. 2 pillars of evidence against her crumbled under real scrutiny. But Jake knew he needed more than doubt. He needed a plausible alternative to point to who really committed the crime. Then he started tracking the money, a task Reed had abandoned after the first layer because the case was already solved. An account in her name had received transfers from the firm's accounts. Yes, $240,000 over 18 months. But Jake didn't stop there. He brought in a forensic financial analyst and followed a trail beyond where Reed had looked. The money didn't stay in that account, the analyst reported. It was transferred out literally minutes after each deposit, a series of transfers through 3 intermediary banks, then to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. And that account, opened 2 years ago by a shell corporation registered in Delaware. You need to dig into corporate records to see who controls it. Jake dug. He took favors, made calls to contacts in other states, and dealt veiled threats of federal warrants. And eventually, he found it. Shell Corporation was controlled by Marcus Vance through a series of legal intermediaries, designed to obscure ownership. The pattern was clear. It wasn't someone impulsively stealing for themselves. It was someone meticulously constructing a false trail, using an innocent person as a shield while funneling money to a destination they completely controlled. It was a perfect crime in conception, leaving evidence pointing to a scapegoat while the real criminal operated with impunity. But when Jake began investigating Marcus Vance, directly interviewing his colleagues, reviewing personal financial records through warrants he obtained by arguing that Vance was a legitimate suspect, he encountered resistance that went beyond normal legal obstruction. Vance had connections. Expensive lawyers who immediately moved to block each warrant. Allies in positions that mattered. Even more revealing, when Jake pressed Reed to explain why he hadn't investigated Vance when he was an obvious suspect, given that he had access to all the compromised systems, Reed became defensive in a way that suggested more than just professional laziness. Vance was interviewed. It was cleared, Reed said, his voice tense. Based on what? There are no interview notes in the file. Informal interview. He cooperated completely, providing access to everything. A suspect providing access to evidence he himself could have planted isn't clearing him. It's a suspect dictating the terms of his own investigation. Jake was no longer being diplomatic. You're compromising a federal investigation, Reed finally exploded. Back down or I'll face consequences through appropriate channels. Consequences for doing the real investigative work you should have done. Jake didn't back down. For verifying evidence before destroying the life of an innocent person. For interfering in a case that isn't yours. You have jurisdiction as a county sheriff. I have federal jurisdiction. Stay in your lane. But Jake didn't back down. And through an investigation that continued despite Reed's threats, through sources he developed independently, Jake uncovered a hidden truth that explained Reed's resistance. There was a personal history between Reed and Vance, not an obvious friendship, but a connection through a third party, a favor Vance had done years ago that Reed was now repaying through intentional negligence, not explicit corruption, but an implicit compromise that made Reed unfit to investigate objectively. And it was while Jake was building a case to prove her innocence that the situation escalated from legal to dangerous. She received her first threat 3 days after Jake began his investigation, a call from a blocked number. A voice distorted by software. "Stop fighting. Accept the deal they offered, or it will get worse for you." She reported it to Jake, who took it seriously, but had no way to trace anonymous calls. He installed tracking on her phone, advised her to vary her routine, and stay in public areas. But the threats continued, escalating. Her car was vandalized too. Days later, all 4 tires slashed, "Confess or pay" spray painted across the hood. This happened in her apartment parking lot at night, while she was sleeping. The message was clear: "We know where you live. We can get to you whenever we want." Jake increased patrols around her building, but resources were limited. He couldn't maintain constant surveillance without strong official justification, and Reed was blocking Jake's attempts to formalize threats as part of a federal investigation. Then came the real attempt. Early Thursday morning, 3:40 a.m., she woke to the sound of someone forcing a door lock. It wasn't subtle. Whoever it wasn't trying to be discreet. They were sending a message through Audacity. She froze for a second that felt like an eternity. Then her brain went into survival mode. Phone already in hand, she dialed 911 while barricading herself in her room. The next-door neighbor, elderly man with chronic insomnia, heard a commotion, shouted through the wall that he was calling the police. The noise stopped. Footsteps running down the stairs. When the police arrived 5 minutes later, the door had crowbar marks, but the intruder had fled. Jake arrived 15 minutes after the initial call. Not officially assigned, but responding, because he knew this wasn't a random burglary attempt. He found her in her apartment, surrounded by officers writing a report, trembling not from cold, but from adrenaline and residual terror. Coincidence? The officer who was preparing the report suggested. There has been an increase in break-ins in the area. During the day when residents are at work, Jake corrected. Not at 4 in the morning when they're home and can identify intruders. That was intimidation. He pulled her aside after the other officers left. Someone wants you scared enough to accept a deal, to stop fighting, to confess and close the case before the real investigation exposes who's really behind this. "Vance," she whispered, understanding. For the first time, the full magnitude of the danger. "He won't stop. Not while you're a threat to him," Jake confirmed. "But now we have a pattern. Threats, vandalism, attempted break-in, that supports the theory that someone wants you silenced. And innocent people don't need to silence victims." Jake understood at that moment. She wasn't just facing an unjust legal system that had decided her guilt based on planted evidence. She was facing an active conspiracy, Vance, and whoever was helping him, that was willing to escalate to violence to ensure the scapegoat remained silent. That he accepted a plea deal that would permanently close the investigation and allow the real criminal to escape completely. And no one but Jake believed enough to protect her. Reed dismissed threats as her attempt to gain sympathy. Jake's superiors were beginning to question how much time and resources he was devoting to a case that was already resolved. Even her public defender was arguing that accepting a settlement was the only safe option. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When you're telling the truth, but the entire system is invested in a different version, the people who threaten to expose that truth become targets, not heroes. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there comes a point in anyone's career in a position of authority where you have to choose between preserving what you've built and doing what you know is morally necessary. And that choice rarely comes with guarantees, rarely offers a clear path where you can have both. For Jake, that moment had arrived, and its weight was becoming heavier with each passing day. With each time superiors called him in for a talk about his priorities. With each look from colleagues who began to see him not as an ally but as a problem. Jake knew he was risking everything. He wasn't being dramatic or exaggerating. It was an objective assessment based on signs he could no longer ignore. A career he had meticulously built over 20 years, starting as a municipal police officer, responding to domestic calls at 3 in the morning, working through years as a detective, where he proved his competence. Being elected sheriff through a reputation for integrity, all of that was at stake, real and tangible. His reputation had been built on objectively following evidence, on not letting personal feelings compromise investigations, and treating all cases with the same impartial dedication. But now, colleagues who had worked with him for years were murmuring that Jake had become obsessed with her case in a way that was unprofessional, that he was questioning the work of a respected federal detective for reasons that seemed more personal than procedural. "You're spending too much time on this," his most senior deputy had said 3 days earlier, his tone cautious, as if trying to sound concerned rather than critical. "We have our own cases that need attention, and federal authorities already have that covered. The feds have a poorly investigated case that will result in a wrongful conviction," Jake had replied, uninterested in softening the truth. "But it's not your responsibility to correct their investigation, especially when they're making it clear that your interference is not welcome." And it was interference, Jake couldn't deny. Reed had made it absolutely clear that he considered Jake's involvement an obstacle, not help. He had escalated complaints to Jake's superiors, arguing that the local sheriff was compromising the federal investigation through uncoordinated actions that could contaminate evidence or alert suspects. Jake's superiors, the county board of supervisors, who technically had no authority over day-to-day operations but controlled the budget and could make his professional life miserable, if they chose, had suggested in terms that left no room for misunderstanding that he should back down. "Let justice take its natural course," the chairman had said. "It's not our role to question federal authorities." But Jake had seen exactly where the natural course was going. Sarah Mitchell would be formally charged. A trial would be scheduled where a jury would see evidence that seemed superficially convincing. An overburdened public defender would make an adequate but uninspired defense. And she would be sentenced to 15 years for a crime she didn't commit, while Marcus Vance enjoyed stolen money in a jurisdiction that didn't extradite, and Jake couldn't accept that. Not when he had the power to stop it. Not when Rebecca Torres still haunted him, when he would sometimes wake up remembering her eyes in that hospital. A silent accusation. "You said the system would work." But at night, when he reviewed files alone in an empty office with only a desk lamp illuminating scattered documents, when the coffee had gone cold in the mug he'd forgotten to drink, when the silence was broken only by the wall clock ticking away the hours, Jake faced a question he had avoided confronting directly. Was his motivation purely professional? Because when I thought about her and I was thinking about her more and more, not as a suspect or case number 2847, but as Sarah. As a person, my thoughts went beyond investigative details. I thought about how she maintained dignity under pressure that would destroy most people. How she still said please and thank you, even when she was clearly exhausted and terrified. I thought about the way she thanked him for believing her, a sincerity in her voice that broke something in him that he had carefully guarded for years. I thought about her vulnerability, not weakness, but a raw humanity she couldn't hide and wasn't trying to use for manipulation. The way her hands trembled when they reviewed documents together. The way her voice faltered when she spoke about the parents she'd lost, about how she would be completely alone if convicted because she had no one to visit her in prison. The way she looked at him not with a romanticized savior image, but with genuine gratitude and the growing trust of someone who had learned not to trust, but was choosing to take the risk anyway. And Jake recognized what was happening because he wasn't an idiot and because he had enough experience to identify the signs. She was starting to matter in a way that transcended the affair. She was starting to matter as a person whose well-being affected him in ways that weren't purely professional. This was dangerous. Profoundly, fundamentally dangerous. Because emotional commitment compromises judgment. It was true that Jake had preached for years, that he had seen colleagues violate with disastrous results. When you care too much, you start seeing what you want to see instead of what's there. You start interpreting evidence through a filter of bias instead of objectivity. And there was always a possibility, remote but existing, that Jake was wrong. That the forensic evidence he found had an alternative explanation. That the expert analysis he hired had missed something. That she was, in fact, guilty and manipulating him through a performance of innocence so convincing that even experienced investigators were being fooled. If that were the case, if Jake was wrong and ruined his career defending a criminal who had perfectly outwitted him, then it wouldn't just be a professional failure. It would validate every person who had argued that emotional compromise undermines police work, and it would be a permanent stain on the legacy he had worked 20 years to build. But every time she questioned, every time she forced herself to revisit evidence, looking for something she had missed, a sign that she was being manipulated, she arrived at the same conclusion, through the same logic. The pattern was very consistent. Forged emails, signatures, a money trail leading to Marcus Vance. Escalating intimidation, attempts, everything pointed to an elaborate conspiracy using her as a scapegoat. It wasn't Jake wanting to believe her, and therefore interpreting favorable evidence. It was objective evidence, leading to the inevitable conclusion of her innocence, and someone else's guilt. And if Jake could separate emerging feelings from factual assessment, he believed he could. Even though he recognized that everyone thought they could do it better than they actually could, then he had an obligation to continue. Even if it cost him the badge he'd worn for 20 years. Even if it cost him the reputation he'd so carefully built. Even if it resulted in him ending up like Jake Dawson, the former sheriff who'd destroyed his own career in a quixotic crusade based on compromised judgment. Because some things matter more than a career. And ensuring that an innocent person isn't destroyed by the very system that should protect them, a system Jake had dedicated his entire life to serving, but recognized was fallible. Sometimes spectacularly, so was one of those things. Jake had done the math. Worst case scenario, he was wrong about her innocence. It would destroy his career, and it would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of emotional commitment. Best case scenario, it would prove her innocence. Expose the corruption that allowed Vance to operate with impunity. But he would still face professional repercussions for questioning federal agents and violating chain of command. There was no scenario in which Jake could emerge from this with his career intact and his reputation enhanced. The best he could hope for was to prove he was right and accept the consequences of having gotten there through methods his superiors disapproved of. And he had made peace with that. Or at least, he had decided that consequences were worth the potential outcome. But the decision grew more complicated with each passing day. Each time he saw her in meetings to review investigation progress, in moments when she stopped by the police station to check for updates, in late night calls when she received a new threat and Jake was the first person to call. Proximity was creating an intimacy that Jake hadn't planned but also wasn't actively avoiding in the way he should have. Conversations drifted from purely casual to personal. She talked about her parents, about loneliness, about the fear not only of prison, but of dying alone without anyone she would miss. Jake shared about Rebecca Torres, about a failed marriage, about his choice to prioritize badge over relationship, and how he was questioning whether it had been worth it. Mutual vulnerability created a connection that both recognized, but neither was explicitly naming. And Jake knew he was playing with fire, that if their relationship became romantic during the investigation, it would compromise not only the case but his testimony in any subsequent trial. So she maintained boundaries. Not perfectly, she allowed herself to care. She allowed conversations that went beyond the strictly professional. But she didn't allow touching beyond what was necessary. She didn't allow meetings that didn't have a clear investigative pretext. She didn't allow words that crossed from professional to personal concern. But boundaries were becoming harder to maintain. And Jake recognized, with a mixture of fear and resignation, that when this was over, when he proved her innocence, or failed trying, he would have to confront what had grown between them, and decide if it was real, or an artifact of extreme circumstance. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a point in any relationship, especially one born in extraordinary circumstances, where one person literally depends on another for survival, where closeness, forced by necessity, transforms into a connection chosen by free will, where gratitude evolves into something more complex and terrifying. For Jake and Sarah, that transformation happened not through a single dramatic moment, but through an accumulation of shared vulnerabilities, of conversations that began about their affair but ended about life, of a gradual recognition that they were beginning to mean something to each other that completely transcended the roles of protector and protected. As the investigation progressed through the second and third weeks, as Jake delved not only into evidence, but into understanding the full context of her life, because proper defense required knowing not only legal facts, but the human history that made her a credible target for Vance's accusations, closeness between them grew in ways that both tried to resist, but were inevitable. Jake needed to understand her story to construct a defensive narrative that an eventual jury would believe. He needed to know about her family, about her isolation, about why a 28-year-old woman didn't have the support network that most people had. So he asked, and she answered, and conversations that began clinically drifted into personal territory. She spoke of her parents, not just the fact that they were dead, but the texture of who they were. A father who brought accounting work home, who taught her about integrity by example, refusing to cut corners even when it would be profitable. A mother who came home from school with stories about students who believed that education was about building character, not just transmitting information. They taught me that doing the right thing mattered, she said one night, sitting in Jake's office after hours, reviewing depositions. That honesty was eventually rewarded, and now I'm being punished for exactly that. For trusting Marcus. For not questioning when he asked for access to systems. For assuming that a superior wouldn't use an employee in this way. Her voice broke. Jake saw tears welling up as she tried to control them. A lifetime habit of not showing vulnerability in public. And he did something protocol didn't cover. He took her hand. Not romantic, just human. A physical anchor. Offering comfort that words couldn't. It's not your fault, he said. Not for the first time, but with a conviction he hoped would finally penetrate. Predators like Vance are experts at exploiting exactly the qualities you should be praised for having. Trust isn't weakness. He turned it into a weapon, but that's his fault, not yours. She held his hand back, squeezing it as if it were a lifeline. And they stayed like that for a moment that lasted longer than strictly necessary, both aware that a boundary was being crossed but neither wanting to back down. Conversations about family led to conversations about isolation. How? After her parents died, she had withdrawn socially, not by conscious choice, but because she didn't know how to process loss of that magnitude in social circles that were superficial, college friends who didn't know how to deal with grief, and who gradually stopped inviting her. Eventually, I stopped expecting invitations, she admitted. It's easier to be intentionally alone than to be constantly reminded that I was alone because of abandonment. Jake understood this viscerally. He shared about his own isolation, not born of loss but of a choice to prioritize career over relationships, of a marriage that failed because distinction always won. I built walls, he said. I told myself it was necessary for work, that emotional distance allowed for objectivity. But the truth is, it was easier than risking getting hurt again. And now, she asked, looking directly at him in a way that made it impossible to look away. Now I'm questioning whether walls protected me or just imprisoned me. A confession Jake hadn't planned to make, which he escaped because proximity had lowered his defenses in ways he wasn't aware of until it was too late. And she, seeing Jake work on her case with a dedication that completely transcended professional obligation, seeing him sacrifice relationships with colleagues who didn't understand his obsession, seeing him spend his own money hiring experts when the departmental budget didn't cover it, seeing him believe when literally no one else in the system believed, began to feel something she couldn't explicitly name, but that was undeniable. It wasn't simple gratitude, although gratitude was there. It was a deeper recognition. For the first time in her adult life, someone was fighting for her without expecting anything in return, without a hidden agenda, without calculating the cost-benefit of the investment. Jake was risking his career, reputation, and professional relationships, not because she had offered something or because he expected reward, but simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. And that kind of integrity, rare, costly, authentic, awakened something in her that she had kept carefully buried since a relationship that ended badly years ago. Not sudden passion or romanticized savior, but a recognition that Jake was the kind of person she had begun to believe no longer existed. Someone whose actions matched his words, who demonstrated character through choices when no one was watching, who valued truth more than convenience. There were moments when the tension between them was palpable, not necessarily sexual, but fraught with possibility. Working late at the office, their shoulders brushing as they reviewed documents scattered across their desks, Jake bringing her coffee after a sleepless night, remembering how she drank it without having to ask, Sarah making a rare joke that provoked genuine laughter from him, a sound she realized she had begun to value disproportionately. And there was a real breaking point, not dramatic, but significant. It was after a particularly brutal session with the prosecution, where they had presented new evidence that allegedly strengthened the case against Sarah. Jake had quickly identified it as fabricated timestamps that didn't make sense, documents that conveniently appeared after Jake began questioning the original narrative, but the psychological impact on Sarah was devastating. She had maintained her composure during the meeting, answering her lawyer's questions with forced calm. But as soon as they left, as soon as they were in the parking lot, away from the prosecution's eyes, she crumbled. Not dramatically, not hysterically, but silently and completely. She stopped beside the car, leaned against the cold metal, and covered her face with her hands. "It doesn't matter what you find," the voice came out muffled, broken. "It doesn't matter how much you prove. They're going to convict me anyway. The system doesn't care about the truth when it has a convenient scapegoat. And I'll spend the next 15 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. And Marcus will be on a beach somewhere spending money he stole, and nobody but you will know the difference." Jake could have offered platitudes. "The system works. Justice prevails." All comforting phrases that police officers use to keep victims cooperating. But Sarah deserved more than comforting lies. She deserved honesty, even when it hurt. "You're right that the system often fails," he said, positioning himself in front of her, forcing her to look at him as he finally lowered his hands. "I've seen it fail many times. I've seen guilty people get away with technicalities, and innocent people get crushed because they didn't have the resources to defend themselves properly. The system is imperfect, but it doesn't always fail. And I won't stop fighting until I prove your innocence or exhaust every available resource." "That's a promise. Why?" The question came out as a desperate whisper. "Why risk everything for me? You didn't know me 3 weeks ago. You owe me nothing. Why destroy your career for someone who could be convicted anyway?" It was a question Jake had avoided confronting directly, one he'd danced around in his own thoughts late into the night. But standing there, seeing the raw pain in her eyes, seeing someone who had been strong for so long beginning to fracture under impossible weight, he couldn't offer anything but the truth. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said first, a moral anchor he couldn't abandon. "Because you're innocent and the system is failing you in a way I can't ignore. But also, ... double quotes." He paused, processing the words before releasing them, knowing that once said, they couldn't be undone. "Also, because you matter. To me, personally. In a way that goes beyond mere circumstance or duty." The confession was simple, but laden with the weight of everything left unsaid. An acknowledgement that the line between professional and personal had been crossed. That what had grown between them in recent weeks was real and complicated, and impossible to ignore any longer. The silence that followed was dense, full of unspoken things. Sarah looked at him, processing words, searching for manipulation or an agenda, and finding none. Just the raw honesty of a man admitting something that compromised his own judgment. In ways they both recognized. Jake, double quotes, she began, not knowing how to finish. You don't need to say anything, he interrupted gently. I'm not asking for anything. Just being honest about why I'm doing this. Because you deserve to know the truth, even when it's complicated. But she placed her hand on his face, a gentle touch that was a choice, not a reaction. I matter too, she whispered. With you. In a way that scares me, because the last time I trusted someone like this, I was destroyed. But you, you're not like him. You're not like anyone else. And in that parking lot, under a sky that was beginning to darken, they both understood what had started as a professional relationship between investigator and victim had irreversibly transformed into something deeper, more personal, more terrifying, because there was still so much that could go wrong. Comment below. This makes sense to me. When someone fights for you without expecting anything in return, how can you not develop feelings that transcend gratitude? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there is a brutal difference between legal victory and real victory, between being declared innocent on paper and having your life restored in practice. For Jake and Sarah, that distinction became painfully clear when the breakthrough finally arrived. But it revealed just how incomplete justice can truly be. The breakthrough came in the fourth week, when Jake tracked down Marcus Vance, who had disappeared after charges against Sarah were formalized. Vance was in a Caribbean country without an extradition treaty, but had made a crucial mistake, transferring money back to the United States to finance an extravagant lifestyle. Jake obtained a warrant for bank records. Forensic analysis revealed a digital pattern identical to that of the fraudulent transfers attributed to Sarah. Concrete proof. The same person who opened accounts in her name had access to the stolen money. With this evidence plus accumulated forensic analyses, the case against her collapsed. The prosecution withdrew the charges. She was formally exonerated. But exoneration did not undo the damage. Sarah had lost her job, her reputation was destroyed, her savings depleted. And Vance, despite an arrest warrant, was out of reach, living in luxury. Justice partially served, but not completely. Jake faced consequences, an internal investigation for inappropriate conduct, questioning of his judgment, and unsubtle suggestions that he should resign. A 20-year career compromised for choosing to do the right thing. When they met after his dismissal at Cafe, neutral territory, the tension was palpable. Thank you, she said, for believing, for risking everything. I don't know how to repay you. You owe me nothing. I did it because it was right. And because you deserved someone fighting for you. Brutal pause. It cost me. Career probably over. Reputation compromised. Was it worth it? Yes. Would I do it again? Without hesitation? Sarah understood then. He hadn't saved her expecting to be a hero or out of gratitude. He saved her because he saw injustice and couldn't stand by. That integrity costly changed something between them permanently. What do we do now? She asked. We rebuild, Jake replied. You find a new job, a new city if necessary. I accept retirement, discover who I am without a badge. And we find out if what's between us is real or just an artifact of trauma. It was an honest acknowledgement there was something between them. But validating whether it was genuine would require time outside of the crisis. What if it's real? Sarah asked. Then we'll have time to explore without pressure. Jake took her hand. But first, you need to heal, rebuild, and you can't do that feeling obligated. I don't feel obligated, she corrected. I feel connected, in a scary way. But you're not like the people who hurt me. And maybe it's worth taking the risk again, sitting, their hands intertwined, aware that the journey was not over, Vance free. careers destroyed, future uncertain, but feeling for the first time something beyond fear, hope. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a devastating truth that Jake and Sarah were only beginning to confront. Victory against a corrupt system rarely ends with legal exoneration. It ends with retaliation from powerful people you exposed, with consequences that unfold for months or years, with the discovery that doing the right thing doesn't protect you, it often makes you a bigger target. And for them, that truth was about to manifest itself in ways none of them fully anticipated. The first few weeks after Sarah's exoneration were strange, not celebratory, but a cautious navigation of a new normal that was simultaneously a relief and devastating. She was no longer facing prison, an undeniable victory, but she also had no job, no savings, no intact reputation. She applied for positions and received polite rejections without explanation, or worse, complete silence. A Google search of her name still showed headlines about her imprisonment before showing corrections about her exoneration. "I'm professionally radioactive," she told Jake, 2 weeks after the charges were dropped, sitting in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of rejected applications. "Even if you're innocent, nobody wants to hire someone associated with a financial scandal. Perception matters more than truth." Jake couldn't disagree because he'd experienced a similar situation. An internal investigation into his conduct had concluded without formal charges, but the atmosphere at the precinct had irreversibly changed. Colleagues who used to seek his advice now avoided him. Superiors were polite but distant. An invitation for early retirement was reiterated, this time less as a suggestion and more as a clear expectation. "I'll probably accept," Jake admitted. "Staying would be a constant battle. And honestly, I'm tired of fighting a system that should be on our side." But while they were processing the immediate consequences of their victory, a greater threat was materializing in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. Marcus Vance, safe in a country without extradition, wasn't just living in comfortable exile. He was actively working to destroy Jake and Sarah's credibility in ways that would protect his own reputation and prevent future legal action. First came articles planted in financial publications, anonymous sources, questioning whether Sarah's exoneration was legitimate or the result of an investigation compromised by the sheriff for personal gain. Insinuations of an inappropriate relationship between Jake and Sarah. Suggestions that evidence was fabricated or intentionally misinterpreted. A narrative carefully constructed to cast doubt on their victory without making direct accusations that could result in a defamation lawsuit. He's rewriting history, Sarah realized. Reading the latest article with growing horror. Becoming a victim of a flawed investigation instead of a criminal who got away with it. And people are believing it because his narrative is more comfortable than admitting that the system almost destroyed an innocent person. Then came more direct threats. Jake received a call from a lawyer representing Vance. "Yes, my client is considering civil action for defamation and malicious harassment against you and Ms. Mitchell. The accusations you made have destroyed the reputation of a respected businessman. Unless public retractions are made, ... It was a bluff. Vance filing a lawsuit would require returning to a jurisdiction where he could be arrested. But the threat served its purpose: intimidation, reminding them that he had the resources to make their lives miserable, even from a distance. And there were more sinister incidents. Sarah's car was vandalized, again not a painted message this time, but brakes cut in a way that nearly caused an accident. Jake's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but case files were scattered. A clear message: "We can get to you." "He won't stop," Sarah said after attempting to stop him, her voice trembling, not only from fright, but from exhaustion at living in constant fear. "Even with a warrant, even out of the country, he has the means to harass us indefinitely. When will this end?" Jake had no comforting answer. Because men like Vance with money, connections, an ego that refuses to accept defeat rarely stop. They escalate. They find new ways to retaliate. and victims are left looking over their shoulders indefinitely. But there was a deeper revelation that they were both processing through those difficult weeks. What had grown between them during the investigation was proving to be real outside the context of the crisis. It wasn't just trauma bonding or gratitude mistaken for affection. It was genuine connection built on vulnerability, mutual respect, and recognition of character, demonstrated through impossible choices. They began spending time together intentionally, not out of necessity, but by choice. Dinners without an investigative agenda. Walks where they talked about the future, instead of just surviving the present. Moments where they allowed themselves to consider the possibility that the person they met at the worst possible time could be the right person at the wrong time, who would eventually become the right person. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted one night, sitting on Jake's porch watching the sunset. Not of Vance, or not just him, but of this, of trusting again, of letting someone matter when the last time I did, it was used against me. "Me too," Jake confessed. "Not in the same way, but discovering that I built my whole life around a badge, and now, without it, I don't know who I am. And letting someone see that uncertainty, when I was always the one who had the answers. It was mutual vulnerability that strengthened rather than weakened them. Proof that their connection wasn't based on a savior-and-saved dynamic, but on the recognition of shared humanity, of imperfections, fears, and hopes that they both carried. And it was in this context, rebuilding lives separately, but growing closer emotionally. Facing continuous retaliation from Vance, but refusing to let fear dominate, that they realized a fundamental truth. The greatest battle had not been proving her innocence in court. It had been, and continued to be, protecting what they had built together against external forces determined to destroy it. Because there's a devastating difference between someone who helps when it's convenient, and someone who sacrifices everything: career, reputation, financial security, when literally no one else is willing to believe you. Jake had proven not only that Sarah was innocent, but that there are people in the world willing to do the right thing even when it costs them everything. And that kind of integrity, that kind of loyalty, demonstrated through action, not words, was rare and precious in ways they both recognized. And while Sarah processed how the gratitude she felt had evolved into something deeper: respect, admiration, and yes, a kind of love she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. While Jake faced the consequences of choices he'd made but discovered he could live with them because the alternative would have been intolerable. They both knew their journey was far from over. How do you rebuild your life after being publicly accused even when exonerated? The answer was revealing itself slowly, painfully, one day at a time. One rejected application followed by an eventual yes, one corrected headline at a time. How do you thank someone who lost their career defending you? Not with words, Sarah was learning, but by being present as she navigated her own journey of redefining identity without the badge she had carried for 20 years. And how do you distinguish gratitude from something deeper, when the person who saved you is also the person who has come to mean more than anyone else? Through time, they discovered, through continuing to choose each other when the crisis passed and choice was no longer a necessity but a desire. But Marcus Vance, free in a distant land, wasn't finished. Men who build empires through fraud don't give up when they lose a battle, they retaliate. And retaliation was escalating from planted articles to legal threats to incidents bordering on physical violence. He had resources, he had motivation, and he had demonstrated a complete lack of moral boundaries. The biggest battle, Jake and Sarah were realizing, wasn't proving her innocence. It was protecting both of them, and what was growing between them from the consequences of having won against a man who wouldn't accept defeat. If you've made it this far with me, if you've felt every second of this journey of injustice transformed into struggle, if you've understood the weight of Jake literally risking everything: career, reputation, safety for a woman whom the entire system had decided was guilty without proper investigation, then you know this story is about something much bigger than romance or legal suspense. It's about what happens when a person refuses to accept a convenient narrative, when someone chooses to believe you, when the whole world has already decided your guilt, when integrity costs everything but you pay the price anyway because the alternative standing still while an innocent person is destroyed is simply unacceptable. And look, if this kind of story resonates with you, if you want to continue exploring these journeys where justice doesn't come easily, where doing the right thing costs more than it should, where connections are born not in perfect moments, but in the trenches of impossible battles against failing systems, then signing up here is the way to continue walking with me. Because I create each script thinking of you, someone who understands that the most powerful stories aren't those where the hero wins without consequences, but those where victory costs so much that you question whether it was worth it until you realize that not fighting would have cost something far more precious: your humanity. Comment below. I'm with you until the end, because I want to know that you're here. That Sarah and Jake's struggle resonated with you. That you recognized the brutal difference between a system that should protect the innocent and a system that often devours them. That you understood that sometimes the most radical thing someone can do is simply question when everyone else has already accepted the easy answer. And if this touched you in any way, you recognized Sarah in someone who was unjustly accused. If you saw Jake reflected in someone who did the right thing, even when it cost them everything. If you understood that gratitude and love are easily confused, but that sometimes the distinction doesn't matter as much as the choice to. Continue leave a like so I know. It's not about numbers. It's about knowing that what I create reaches you on the other side and means something real. Something that makes you think about integrity, about the cost of doing the right thing, about the kind of person you want to be when faced with an impossible choice. And because I know you don't want this story to end here, because stories like this demand a continuation, demand to see what happens when Vance's retaliation escalates, when Jake and Sarah have to decide whether to build a future together, or if the weight of the past is too great. There's a video over here that continues in the same vein. Click and follow along there. Until the next chapter.